It is a huge, huge, huge honor for me to be interviewing Barry Musikant, who is a legend in endodontics. I mean, you're a legend, and the thing I love about you is you always, one of my maxims that I learned from the book Beating the Street by Peter Lynch. He said everybody would stay in Wall Street, and he knew the biggest investor in the world was Warren Buffett, who stayed in Omaha and didn't get caught up in all the Wall Street hype and all that. And he took he had the same approach. Instead of reading all these papers and 401ks and 401 quarterlies and all that, he would fly to a state, and then he would drive around all week, and he would go visit the companies. And he said, I wanted to go into the company. I wanted to see if it was clean and organized, if it was friendly. And I wanted to know if I walked in off the street, if I could meet the man, the CEO, the one in charge. And the ones who made a religion of availability and showed you the plan and talked to you in person, he goes, those were always the long-term investment strategies. And the companies he saw that were disorganized and not friendly, and the CEO didn't have time to meet, he said they were always taking stock. And I'll never forget when I was in New York, I went to your office, and not only did you invite me in and show me around, but you spent hours with me on teeth. And you spent so much time, and it wasn't just me because I'm with Dental Town or something. You do that to everyone.
I'm still doing it.
And then when you were at the Townie meeting, I even made a joke about it with you. I mean, at the Townie meeting, you had all your stuff up in your room, and you were just telling people, oh, yeah, come on up to my room. And I'd be sitting there at the bar.
People still teasing me about that.
I know. I'd be in the bar at 10 o'clock at night, and people say, yeah, I was just in Barry's room for 3 hours. That guy is amazing. So you just eat, live, breathe, and die and sleep endo.
One fellow, and I won't say his name, kind of said he was making innuendos, funny innuendos, nothing nasty. And I said, we're talking about endo, not innuendo.
So thank you for spending time with me. Tell people about yourself. Tell people your story. You're in probably the most, well, number one, you're in the largest city in the world. I mean, in North America or in the United States and Canada, Manhattan. You're in New York City, Manhattan, which I just read an interesting stat that if the whole world's 7 billion people lived in the same density as Manhattan, all humans could live in New Zealand.
Yeah,
that's how dense Manhattan is. And so with all this massive competition, you're crushing it. I mean, how many endodontists are in your group?
Right now we have about 5. And sometimes 5, sometimes 6. There's been a little variation.
And how many days a week are you open? What are your hours?
We're open 7 days a week.
I know. You're what a legend. I mean, my gosh. And that's what Americans deserve. And, I was just in Australia, and they're all whining that the government, when I started lecturing there in the 90s and stuff, I mean, the average dentist would tell me they couldn't get in a new patient for 6 weeks. And now I'm back there, now, and they're all upset because the government opened up a bunch of new dental schools and let in about 1,000 foreign dentists. And I kept telling them, it's not about you. It's not about the dentists. It's about the patients. And you weren't patient-centered. And in America, I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. You still can't find a dentist open on Sunday in a town that has 4 million people. And what are your hours on those 7 days a week?
Well, we're open from 8 in the morning till 8 at night, Monday through Friday, and then on Saturday open till 5, and Sunday generally till 2. But if a patient comes in at 1:30, we're staying maybe till 4. We're there to serve. I mean, that's how we make our living. We have to be consistent. We have to be humble, and frankly grateful.
And
economy out there. Gratitude and humility go a long way.
You have a legendary company, Essential Dental Systems, edsdental.com. You were an endodontist. What made you decide that all the files you could buy on the market weren't good enough for Barry Musikant, and you decided to start doing your own file system?
Well, it didn't exactly work that way. It really goes back to the University of Pennsylvania when I was a student, undergraduate. And
so you were taught by the Quaker on the box of Quaker oatmeal?
Yeah, that's the guy.
That's the guy. I never knew he was an endodontist. I'll enjoy my oatmeal even better tomorrow.
He knew his oats. But anyway, the fact is we learned in those days reamer file. Reamer file. 10 reamer, 10 file, 15 reamer, 15 file.
Are you saying a reamer separately than a file? A reamer?
That's right. A reamer is different than a file, significantly different.
And explain the difference between a reamer and a file.
Yeah, a reamer has about half the number of flutes in the same 16 millimeters of working length as a file. There's 16 versus about 30. It's the same 16 millimeters of working length, so the flutes, if there are fewer of them, they're twice as vertically oriented, okay? Now, we all learned to use our instruments with a watch winding motion, right? That's how we learned it.
And explain what that is, because a lot of these kids, they never had a pocket watch.
It's, you take it, every young dental graduate knows, takes his K file, goes in and watch winds it. It's a horizontal motion going back and forth, and you coordinate that with lifting up. So you're engaging and pulling up. And that works for a file. It's not very efficient, but when you use a file with all those horizontal flutes, you're engaging when you go horizontally, and you're shipping dentin away when you go vertically, right?
Right.
That's kind of a pain in the neck. And also, if you think about it, you got to put that instrument back in the canal. You probably got debris in that canal, even though you still got some irrigants in there. But as you work your way apically, with those horizontal flutes tend to clog the canal in the apical third. And many dentists say, I'm doing great through an 8, a 10, right around a 15 or 20, I'm starting to lose some length. Well, you know, you can say that's just your skill factor, and certainly there's certain people that could do a great root canal with a pitchfork. But when you have an instrument like a K5 with all those horizontal flutes, the tendency to pack debris apically is much higher than if you use an instrument that has vertically oriented flutes. And when you put that back, the tooth tends to glide past the debris because you don't have horizontal flutes, you have vertical. It's something, it's just visual if you see it, and it just makes all the sense in the world. Plus the fact, when you're using a ream, you got half the number of flutes along length, so you got less engagement to start with. So there's that reamer with the vertical flutes. You do your first clockwise stroke as part of your watch winding. Not only do you have half the number of flutes, which means there's less engagement, but with that first clockwise stroke, you're immediately shaving dentin away. All of a sudden, less engagement. Less engagement for two reasons, right? Fewer flutes, you just shave a little away, lets you get to the apex easier, less likely to impact debris. So that's what I learned right off the bat. For me, it was forgetting K-files, let's get into reamers. And for me, it's the most natural thing in the world. And in fact, if you look at the new products that the major companies are coming out with, their new glide path instruments are all with vertical flutes. They're all designed as reamers. They call them files, but they're all reamers.
Okay, but just to be clear, first you said reamers versus files, then all of a sudden you said K-file. So when you originally said reamers, files, you meant K-file.
Yes. When I use the term files, it's generally a K-file type of design, which means, by definition, predominantly horizontally oriented flutes. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And you also threw out the term and irrigants. What irrigants would you be using?
Well, we're typically using sodium hypochlorite. Although I do steal a bit from Steve Buchanan. When I have a vital tooth, the first irrigant I'll put in is 17% EDTA, because the 17% EDTA does not cause the pulp tissue to get tougher. In other words, when you use sodium hypochlorite, it cooks it a little, and it makes it a much more difficult tissue to remove from the canal. In a non-vital case, sodium hypochlorite digests non-vital tissue beautifully.
And what percentage of the bleach are you using, sodium hypochlorite? Just straight out of the bottle, or do you dilute it?
Right out of the bottle, 6% for the most part.
6% straight out of the bottle.
Yeah. Just make sure it doesn't go over the apex.
Yeah, that's what I'll bring. And okay, so continue on your journey. So you got out of Quaker Oatmeal Endodontic School in Pennsylvania.
Get out of there. So I'm using reamers. And in the early days, I would do straight line access with piezo or gates combined. And that was pretty much my endodontics. And that was my endodontics. And I think I turned out a pretty good job, built a large practice based on the results we got. That was the way I did root canal for 20 years.
Okay.
And what 20 years later?
Okay, can I stop you right there?
Sure.
I'm just my job is to ask questions that the viewer might not have got. Explain what you meant by straight line access and the difference between a piezo and a
Okay.
gate.
Well, straight line access today is understood as trying to gain entry into the canal orifice by going through as little curvature as possible. And the reason for that is because the big bugaboo with rotary knife type, to this day, with all the new products that have been introduced, is one of separation, unpredictable separation. So they know if you can get straight line access, there's less chance of cyclic fatigue, which is one of the causes of fracture. And then the other thing of getting a little bit greater taper, it reduces your chances of having engagement along length, reduced chance of torsional stress that can also lead to instrument separation. See, that's the problems inherent to rotary knife type because it's rotating. See, the other thing that I like about the way I do things and what I'm always talking about is keep your arc of motion small. Use a 30 to 45 degree reciprocating handpiece. All of a sudden, you don't have torsional stress or cyclic fatigue. Not worth enough that you're ever going to worry about breaking an instrument. Okay? Now, once you don't break an instrument, and you know you're not going to break an instrument, your whole mentality changes. Because you can take an 06 reamer, 02 tape at 06 reamer, very thin, and now because you know it can't break, you can work it aggressively, buccally and lingually. And that's very important because most canals don't turn out to be rounded cross-section. They turn out to be oval in cross-section, at least for a major portion of their length, sometimes all the way down to the apex. But that's not the exception. That's more the rule. It's only a tooth like a maxillary central incisor that tends to be conical the entire length. So if you're conical the entire length and it's nice and patent, it's broad, by all means use rotary, be a happy guy. Just that's not reality for most teeth.
And most endo is on molars, not incisors.
Well, the two central incisors, maxillary central, represent 1/16 of the teeth in our mouth. The rest of them are looking a little more complicated.
Right. So, but go back and explain piezos and gates, because at 53, sometimes I'm not quite sure what these kids are walking out of as school. I mean, like, I don't know if the graduates even
piezos
still
are
use
parallel tapered instruments that have a non-cutting tip, and they're not there to deepen a canal that hasn't been deepened by other means. It's there just to widen and selectively remove dent from one wall or another. In other words, if you got a C-shaped entry into an orifice, it'd be much nicer if you can straighten that C up. You follow?
Mm-hmm.
Once you can straighten up the entry into the canal and you're using a rotary instrument, you're going to be far less likely to subject that instrument to torsional stresses and cyclic fatigue. I mean, think about it. Let's say you got a coronal curve, then you got an apical curve. Oh man, that rotary nine-tie instrument is negotiating two curves. And we know that the instruments are much more subject to breakage in that type of environment. So, and that's because they are rotating in that canal. You follow what I mean?
Yes.
So when you're subject to that kind of stress, and you have a high incidence of fracture, what you want to do is take steps to alleviate that. So that's where straight line access came from. That's where crown down came from. Crown down endodontic preparations widen the canal first with a greater tapered instrument, then you go in a little deeper with a lesser tapered, a little deeper with a still lesser tapered. Why? Because it's not engaging the full length of the instrument. And it allows the tip of the instrument to have a better tactile sense and not be subject to the stresses of full contact along the entire length of the canal wall. So crown down lets you reduce the contact along length when you're doing rotary nine-tie. This is of practically no significance when you do short arcs of motion as you do with 30 to 45 degree reciprocation.
And then the difference between piezos and gates.
Well, yeah, you could say that a gates is like a short piezo. It's just a little nub of an instrument, and it too has an uncutting tip. And it's just a way to get down the canal, widen the canals a little more. The piezo is much more efficient at straightening a canal wall The Gates Glidden has a more flexible shank, but you still got to worry about it breaking when you take if and when it takes a curve. You don't easily take a curve.
I want you to give a father-son, father-daughter talk. I still see a lot of it seems like whenever I'm in a dental office and someone can't get out a wisdom tooth, I couldn't get out either with their flap. I can't see a damn thing. They got this little bitty flap, and I go in there in the first 2 or 3 minutes. I'm just making the flap bigger so I can see it and I get out. Same thing with endo. You still see people doing an endo through the hole the size of a BB on the top because they're trying to preserve that crown. And I always take the crown off and throw it away. And to me, it's just so much easier and predictable to just redo the crown, get the crown off, get a nice access so you can see. It makes a 2 millimeters shorter.
Yeah, that's a popular motion. I'll tell you, in what you might consider a wealthy city like New York, if I routinely took crowns off, and I will take crowns off where there's obvious decay, I would certainly recommend it come off because you're worried about leakage. And I just read an article that they say, well, you never get a good seal after you reseal a crown. I will tell you, most of the root canal I do when there is a crown there is through the existing crown. I don't remove it. If the margins look good, I'm keeping that. That's what the dentist expects. The patient is spending a pretty good amount for root canal. They don't want to know all of a sudden you're going to double that fee because they're going to have a new crown.
How big of an access will you do? I mean, will you try to make as small a hole as possible through that porcelain crown, or will you open it up for straight line access?
I'll try to make a small access, but my final judgment for the access, whatever it is, whether it's large or small, is I got to find the darn canals. And on Dental Town, there's all this discussion about minimum access and even just making 2 separate openings for the distal and let's say the mesial. And maybe there's some immensely skilled dentist who can do that. But I will tell you, I try to be as conservative as possible. I don't routinely make openings like that. I have to see the canals. And frankly, on a lower molar where I need direct vision to look in, I may have to bring my opening, my access up onto the mesiobuccal cusp a little bit. I've got to make sure I see everything. That's just basic stuff. And obviously I'm using a microscope.
And then when you're done with the endo and you've gone through a crown, what do you think is the best sealer material to go back and seal that hole?
Well, it's funny. If you look at the fellows on Dental Town, a lot of them use amalgam. I kind of got away from amalgam. Not that I think there's anything bad. It's just I'm a creature of popular culture too. So what I tend to do is I land up sealing the canal when I'm done. If there was a crown on there, a layer of glass ionomer. That's it. And then I'll etch that. And after I etch that, I will bond a Herculite to it. That's what I typically do. Unless, of course, I made a post hole in case I'm putting cotton and glass ionomer alone.
And why? And that would be a sandwich technique to have glass ionomer, then a resin composite. Why would you put the glass ionomer on the floor?
Just something I got used to. It's something. I mean, if you ask me why don't I fill the whole thing up with composite, I think glass ionomer's got a pretty good bond in and of itself. On the other hand, I think the Herculite bonded to the glass ionomer and the surrounding walls is pretty good. So I could do a lot of different things.
And who makes Herculite?
Jesus, you got me.
Herculite, was that Kerr?
You want to know I use it every day, and I don't know. I'm guessing it's Dentsply.
Okay, so then I'm sorry to keep interrupting you, but continue on your journey. So you got out of Pennsylvania, you're using reamers and files, straight line access, piezos and gates. How did you go from there to Essential Dental Systems at edsdental.com?
Well, the first product Essential Dental Systems made had very little to do with root canal. It was the FlexiPost, FlexiFlange. And the whole idea was we started lecturing about posts. And basically, posts were either passive or active. And if they're passive, you only had the retention that the saluting cement gave to the post, right? But you didn't have too much stress because you put it in, it's passive. It's a passive placement. So insertional stresses were next to nothing. But you didn't have a lot of retention. On the other hand, we want a lot of retention, but it's the only way to get a lot of retention is with a thread. If you get a lot of retention with a thread, well, traditionally, and common sense logic says you're going to create insertional stresses when you screw that thing in. So you do get more retention, but then you get a lot of stress, and we're all worried about breaking roots. And that was way before we worried about breaking roots with greater tapered preparations. This is just with posts, okay? So what do you do to solve that problem? And it was just the insight we had. If we put a split up the center of the post, then when you screwed it in, it acted as a graduated tap, which meant that each thread incrementally got deeper, but it did not create an overall huge increase in the amount of insertional stresses. So you had minimal insertional stresses, but you had very high retention.
So that was your first product?
That was the first product.
And when you said we thought, who was we? You and who else?
Alan Deutsch and myself. Alan and I started Essential Dental Systems.
Alan who?
Alan Deutsch.
Is he still your partner with that?
Yeah, he's just not here today, but he's my partner.
And so what year did that start?
I think it was back in around 1981. We actually got the idea back in 1977, but then we did about 5 years of testing at Memorial Sloan Kettering. To actually, we had 5 papers, I think, before we ever became a formalized company. And it worked. I mean, the concept works, and I think that's why it's still a very popular product.
So did you patent it?
Hell yeah, we patented it.
And how long is the patent good for? 17 years?
Yeah, I think so. It's, frankly, honest to God, I don't even think about that anymore.
Yeah.
I just keep going because we keep developing new products.
And are you still selling a lot of FlexiPost today?
Yes, we are.
Very good.
We're selling more today than we did years ago.
And why do you think that is? Because of the split up the middle and less.
Well, I think because people see that it functions and intuitively makes sense. You see, if you take a solid shank post with a thread, parallel screw, you screw it in, you're going to have a lot of resistance. You're going to be cranking that in. Common sense tells you you're generating a lot of stress when you screw that thing in. You do the same thing with a split shank post, goes in easily.
And what are you cementing it with?
We use a FlexiFlow composite, a flowable composite.
Okay, and so this would be a perfect time to review. When does a tooth need a post?
Well, my attitude is really when you make the judgment that you don't have enough coronal dentin to support the core buildup. If you have enough, if you've got 3 walls, I don't think you need a post. You put in a bonded composite. But let's say you take a maxillary central, pretty much down to the gum line. There are some people who say place an implant. I think that's crazy. You've got a good tooth. You've got maybe 16, 18 millimeters of length. You make your post hole. You put your post in, stable like a rock. You build a core over it, and you get a restoration with a nice ferrule that's going to last a lifetime.
Okay, and explain what a ferrule is to a listener who missed that.
A ferrule is circumferential support. It's a margin that goes around the tooth that grabs ideally 2 millimeters worth of peripheral tooth structure. They would call that a ferrule. And it's probably the single most important thing in stability of a restoration.
Which is a funny word because a feral cat is a wild cat, but it's good on a crown prep. I never.
Yes. It means different things.
But Barry, when we're talking about a post and how far you will go down, obviously the back molars are just dealing with up and down force. But those incisors are dealing with up and down and lateral forces, shear forces. How far down do you put a post on a posterior teeth, and how is it different on a maxillary central incisor that's tooth's getting hit 3 different ways?
Well, a maxillary central incisor. First of all, if you've got a lot of tooth structure, which you're saying when there's no tooth structure.
Yeah.
Again, it comes back to the ferrule. You've got to have and you better make sure, let's say it's a maxillary tooth, you better make sure you've got a good lingual parallel wall as part of that ferrule. Because if it slips, if it tends to slip off on the lingual, then you'd start loosening the crown. So you've got to not only have a grabbing 2 millimeters, but you better make sure that what you're grabbing, at least on the lingual, is pretty parallel.
Well, maybe feral is the right word, because the definition is existing in a wild or untamed state. So that would be you want 2 millimeters of tooth that's existing in its wild and untamed natural state, having returned to an untamed state from domestication or suggestive of a wild animal. So yeah, the feral is everything. And you think 2 millimeters on a molar is still all you need versus an anterior?
A molar is a different story, because usually the orifice on a central incisor is right on that flat. It's right on that flat, that broken down tooth, down to the gingiva. You take a molar, most often, from my experience, the pulp chamber is recessed into the body of the tooth. So you may still have a few millimeters without really going very deep for a collar of tooth structure. You may have that existing on a molar. So if you've got that and you've got some wall standing up and that pulp chamber is quite deep, you just may be able to build up with a bonded composite again, because it's going to be very easy to grab 2 millimeters of ferrule. And it doesn't have to be deep under the gingiva. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I think you're a gifted teacher. You make everything make sense. So, okay, so that was your first product, and that came out in, you started out in 1977, got it out in 81. What was your second product?
Oh, God, what was our second product? I don't know, we came out with various composites. We came out with Ti-Core, which was a core build-up material. We came out with hand lotion, which is terrific. I tell you, the ones that I remember most clearly are the ones that I had the strongest hand in development. And I had the strongest hand development in the FlexiPost, and I had the strongest hand in developing the SafeSiders. Okay, and the SafeSider is a product, I guess, of about 12 years ago.
That's all? SafeSider's only 12 years old?
Is it about 12, I think? Yeah, I think so.
Really? So 2015, when did you launch that? 2015, in 2003?
Maybe. You know, I don't remember the exact date, but I remember shortly after it came out, you invited me to lecture at the meeting in Las Vegas, the dental.
Yeah, the Townie meeting.
Yeah, and I was laughing because I remember a story you told me when I gave my lecture, and I'm talking about all the good things, and you told me you were sitting next to this woman dentist, and you said, well, gee, it sounds great. She says, it can't be that good, otherwise everybody would be using it.
So
I said, there you go, there's marketing.
So you graduated from Endo school in 69, right?
I got out of my residency. After I graduated in 69, I had a year of internship. Then I had a 2-year endodontic residency. So I got out of my endodontic program in 72.
Okay, so you got out of your endodontic program in 72, and then it took clear to 2003, so that'd be 28 and 3. Why that many years later, what made you come out with a SafeSider?
Oh, that is actually what made me come out with the SafeSider was the introduction of rotary NiTi. And this is the way I perceive it. It's a personal thing. Now, you got to realize I was using reamers. I was very comfortable with piezos. So that's kind of a manual usage of reamers, not files. And I supplemented that with various piezo reamers. And I was okay. But when rotary came out and it was backed by the major companies, you very quickly felt like, boy, if I'm not using all this new stuff, I'm going to be behind the times. So I bought my various systems, and anyway, make a long story short, because it goes back a number of years, I found that being 20 years out, and instead of being a nice young 30, I'm now 50, okay? Somehow I lost my youth, and I'm saying, something's not right here, because now that I'm using rotary NiTi, I didn't break many, but I broke an instrument here and I broke an instrument there, something I was never worried about when I used hand instrument, even though I broke them, because if I occasionally broke a hand instrument, I knew exactly why. I simply had screwed it into the tooth too tight and continued to rotate clockwise, and I broke it, so I knew why. But I thought I had a pretty light touch. I'm using my rotary, and every now and then, for inexplicable reasons, the instrument would break, and that filled me with anxiety. And the last thing I wanted at age 50 was, one, increased anxiety, and frankly, it was something ironic that not only am I worried about increased anxiety, but I'm paying a premium for the privilege. That did not sit well with me.
Well, we'll say the price of it. How much was a file, and then how much was a rotary file?
A reamer in those days, stainless steel, probably under $1. I don't remember what rotary cost, but it was several times that cost. And then shortly after, not immediately, originally when rotary NiTi was used, my memory was that they recommended several uses. But that quickly changed to single usage. And it's funny, I just wrote an article on the problems with complex systems. And I think of rotary NiTi as a complex system. And the reason is because when it fails, there are several factors. And we have to address all those factors. And when you get the failure, you don't know what factor to blame it on. So it's the very definition of a complex system. I want to get away from complex. I like simple and robust. And I found, frankly, that first, because when we first developed the safe side, it was a manual system. So it was watch winding, but there was still short arcs of motion. And then somewhere along the line, we got the idea, why don't we see if we can adapt this to a 30, 45-degree reciprocating handpiece? Well, it adapted beautifully. It just adapted beautifully. And as soon as I had that, I couldn't break an instrument if I wanted to. So I took these instruments out to Gordon Christensen. Jesus, he just tried like crazy to break them, and he couldn't do it.
So 35 degrees, so that would be a circle's 360, so 1/10 of a circle?
Well, it was what was it? It's 30-degree reciprocate. See, it's between a 12th and an eighth of a full rotation.
Between a 12th and an eighth.
Right. But either one is insufficient to produce enough torsional stress or cyclic fatigue to lead to instrument separation. That's not to say you couldn't take the instrument manually and break it. You can break anything manually. But you use and that's another interesting point, because the only instrument I typically use today when we use the safe-siders, and because we've actually gotten beyond the safe-siders, I'll explain that shortly. But the safe-siders starts with an 06 O2 tapered stainless steel reamer, which you can imagine at that dimension is as flexible as you ever need.
And what's it made out of?
Stainless steel.
Okay.
In fact, everything that is O2 tapered is stainless steel. There's no reason to make them out of nickel titanium. They'd be O2 tapered would be way too flexible.
And what is stainless steel made out of?
Stainless steel is made of, there's a whole bunch of different stainless steels, but the ones we have are very rugged, easily sterilizable. They don't lose their edge. They just last a lot longer. Okay, but my point is, I take the first instrument manually, and because it's a reamer design, not a K-file, I get down to the apex pretty quickly, and I take my measurement with my apex locator, right? So let's say I'm 22 millimeters to the apex. I'm happy with the measurement. For the most part, that's the last instrument I use manually. So not only do I do the entire shaping of the canal with an engine-driven system that gets rid of any hand fatigue, but I start at the actual beginning of the glide path. Typically, the glide path was always done manually to a 20. They said 10, but in reality it came to a 20. And then you would incorporate your rotary NiTi systems in a crown-down manner, or some version like that. When you do reciprocation, I'm not looking for crown-down. I'm going from thinner to thicker, and it works well. And you'd say, well, gee, aren't you going to have a stiffer instrument by the time you're up to a 20 or 25? And I say, yeah, but as I'm getting there, I'm going up through a sequence of instruments of stainless steel, and don't forget, they have a flat on them. We have a flat, that's the style of the safe side, flat along its entire length, so it's even more flexible, and it's a reamer which is still more flexible, but I'm creating I'm constantly defining the pathway better and better. So I had a struggle, let's say with an '06, it was a very tight canal. When I put the '08 in, it practically falls in. And I work it buccally and lingually because I know that's where the canal is broader. If I'm in the mesial root of a lower molar, I probably don't have a round canal. Or I have a round one with a lingual extension, right? A buccolingual extension. I want to get those extensions because they may look very thin in the tooth, but they're loaded with bacteria. From the bacteria's point of view, it's a Champs-Élysées. So I want to get all that stuff out. And I can do it. Why? Because I'm not worried about the instrument breaking. When you worry about an instrument breaking, you stay centered. When you stay centered, you're not worrying about the buccal and lingual extensions. What you're really worried about, am I going to have a pretty picture on my mesiodistal periapical x-ray? And more times than not, it looks good, and more times than not, it works. But we're also using graded tapered instruments that, in my mind, by the time you go beyond an 04 taper, maybe many times an 04 taper is even too great, you're taking away too much tooth structure in the mesial and distal. Because we've got such things called furcations that occur on the inner roots of mesial roots, and also distal roots, but most prominent mesial roots of lower molars. That dentin, before you even prep the canal, is thin as can be.
So just to make sure no viewer missed it, the safe sider is because part of that canal is the safe side, the flat side. Explain that just a little more clear in case someone's...
The flat side does two things. It makes the instrument more flexible, but it also leaves room for debris, leaves room for irrigants, right? In other words, even if you took a regular reamer and you put that in the canal, it's going to work pretty well. It's going to work a heck of a lot better than a K file, but it's not going to work as well as a reamer that's got a flat on it. And we've got some new products we're developing, and it always incorporates that flat, and that is the secret, because when we first try various things, we'll try different patterns, we'll get an instrument with certain configuration, and we'll put the flat on ourselves. Just take a diamond disc and just work it down, and you've got yourself your flat. And we see the difference immediately. It makes for a profound difference, and it's beautifully adapted to 30 to 45 degree reciprocation, because it's not going to break.
And also, and just for our viewers, how many root canals do you think you've done in your lifetime?
Oh, God. Enough to fill Yankee Stadium. God, who knows? My mind is...
So you got out of dental school in '69, and you got out of endo school in '72. Then 31 years later, in 2003, you started the Safe Sider file. And how's that doing now? Or you said you've made changes to it, or new products?
Well, we've extended it. It's interesting that you mentioned it. What happened was we're, to a certain extent, responsive to what happens in the marketplace. So what did we see? First of all, you had all these rotary systems coming out, and then all of a sudden, so many, they all have to replace after one visit. It's a very expensive procedure. So then comes their form of reciprocation, which is what I call nonlinear rotation. You know what I'm talking about when you talk about things like wave one. Wave one still generates 200 full rotations per minute, but there is a reciprocating quality to it, except it's 150 degrees in one motion, 30 degrees in another. So every 3 cycles, you gain a full rotation. And since it's used at 600 revolutions per minute, you're still producing 200 full cycles, which can lead you to the torsional stress and cyclic fatigue. But after you gain access to, I guess, at 15 or 20, they'll tell you that may be the only instrument you need. So all of a sudden, we're seeing systems that require a lot fewer instruments. Well, the safe siders are great from a point of view of not breaking, but after the glide path, we were still instrumenting up to a 35 or 40. We're still maybe 6 or 7 more instruments. And we said, we can do better than that. We can do better than that. So what we did is, over the last year, we developed the Tango Endo system. Now, the Tango Endo system represents 2 relieved reamers used in a 45-degree reciprocating handpiece, okay? And we use them after we gain our glide path to a 20 using the original safe-siders. And that goes, like I say, we don't get hand fatigue with that because that's all done engine-driven with our 30-degree reciprocating handpiece. So now you use these two instruments. The first instrument is a 3002, and what we learned, when you use this instrument with the flute design we have on it, you can go from a 2002 to a 3002 automatically. No problem. Works time and time again. And then you can go from a 3002 to a 3004 just using one more instrument. So in effect, we've gone to a 3004 using two more instruments after a 20. And that gives us a greater prep than the wave one. Apically, we take away less tooth structure mesiodistally. Of course, it's an 04 taper rather than an 08 taper. More importantly, and here's the key, because we do reciprocation, I'm working those instruments like I do every instrument in my reciprocating hem. I'm working them vigorously, buccally and lingually. Nobody's been doing that with rotary niatate. Sometimes I'll brush against the walls. That's kind of a wink. You're not brushing aggressively. And not only that, if you ever hit a bifurcation or you hit a merging point, you worry about the instrument breaking because it binds and breaks in rotation. But if you're not doing rotation, you're safe. You see how one feeds into the other? And the key thing, it keeps coming back to this very basic quality. You're not going to break the instrument. Now, I know people who have, I heard them on Dental Town where they say, well, everything breaks. All right, I'm not going to argue. Maybe somewhere in hundreds of thousands of uses, an instrument will break. But it's a real man bites dog story. It doesn't happen. We've taught thousands of dentists. They sit in our courses for 2 days. They're working on 15, 20 teeth. They don't break instruments. They could break it manually.
Who was the famous prosthodontist that taught implants? And I think he ended up in Green Laboratory in Arkansas before he passed away. But what I loved most about him is he would always, his lectures were always on all the cases that he did that failed.
Yeah.
And you go to every endo course and dental course or whatever, and they're just showing their greatest work they ever did.
Yeah.
And in the cosmetic arena, most of it's photoshopped. And so the point I'm trying to make is that when we get to breaking files, I mean, that's a secret. I mean, dentists don't go to the bar and tell the other three dentists they broke a file. So it is something I think I'm sure it's underreported.
I agree with you. And
I mean, I've never seen a cosmetic dentist show a case where his veneers didn't match, the gums were uneven. I mean, they probably only show 1 out of 25 of their cases.
And it's funny because I've been on various websites where they'll say breakage is not a problem anymore. And maybe it isn't that big a problem, but I will tell you this. When I speak to dentists, I say, I don't ask them if they break an instrument. I say, do you worry about breaking an instrument? Oh, yeah, I'm always worried. I'm not saying they're breaking a lot. I don't want anybody to even have that fear because it limits the way the instruments are used. They're used more conservatively, which mesiodistally would be fine to me because I think we're always over-preparing mesiodistally, but they're not preparing the canals buccolingually.
Speaking of preparing the canals, how do you think the dental schools are preparing the dentists today, the dental students, for endodontics? How do you what do you think of their curriculum of how it's taught in America?
Here's where I really get more controversial.
Oh, I love it. I love a Howard Speaks podcast. It's controversial.
Because I've seen too much of it, and I have people looking me straight in the face and deny it. The fact is, if a major company, and I got to be very careful not to mention any company, but if a major company, for argument's sake, contributes $500,000 to a program, what they're contributing to is the exclusivity of that students are not going to be taught anything but that, and the school is obligated to take steps to make sure that even over lunchtime, you don't have a salesman coming in showing an alternative point of view. The deal is made. This is my opinion. I believe that's the case. I have seen examples where, like I could talk about myself, that I've been denied access because they already bought into the program.
Yeah, I lecture in a lot of dental schools every year, and I'm thinking like right now, like University of Tennessee in Memphis. You walk right in the endo department, and there's Tulsa Dental Products name right on the center.
Right.
Donated by. Yeah. So
But
yeah.
but let's say you came from Brasseler, would they let you lecture? That's the big question.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's okay. I think it's fine for schools to take money, but there should be no limit, and there should be complete openness that they're telling their student body where where they're being getting their funds from. And that's the problem today because there's a dichotomy. The schools talk about honor, character building, and it's very important. I mean, my father was a dentist. I still feel like he's over my shoulder looking at me. And
Your father was a dentist?
oh yeah.
Your second.
He was a well-known dentist. He was part of a group of dentists that were the first ones that did porcelain fused to metal. They were the first ones in the world. So I grew up in a very unique dental environment. I was seeing movie stars, and when I go to my father's office when I was 9 years old.
So he was the original Larry Rosenthal.
In let's put it this way: you just opened up differently. My father was a straight, quiet, easygoing guy. He didn't have. I don't think he had a promotional bone in his body. He just got these skills, and due to the first they worked for somebody else, and when the four top guys went off on their own, the entire practice followed. And they had to go off on their own because the guy who was paying them a salary got less predictable in paying it.
And Larry Rosenthal is one of the most genius self-promoters I know. I spent the day in his office one day.
Yeah,
And I was wondering.
he's a nice guy.
I was wondering how does he get all these big cases? And I'm watching him. He's got his own lab. He's doing veneers. Unbelievable. But then afterwards, he said, "Hey, let's go to dinner." But on the way from his office to dinner, we stopped at his porch in like 5 or 6 different clubs, and he's walked in there kissing 80-year-old ladies and hugging them and saying, "Oh, Margaret, oh my God, when are you gonna come see me? You'd look 10 years younger if you whiten those teeth." And he's talking to some like 89-year-old lady to walk her, saying, "Oh my God, if you got veneers, you'd look 20 years younger." And they were just lining up at his doorway to get $50,000 veneer cases.
And that's his nature, and people pay a fortune to learn how to be like Larry Rosenthal, but you have to be born Larry Rosenthal.
Yeah, you also can't be short, fat, and bald. You got to be good looking and have a lot of hair and drive a black Porsche.
Well,
So
he had all those qualities, and actually, he's a very nice fellow when you talk with him. I've seen him, and I don't see any airs about him. He's Larry Rosenthal.
Yeah, he's got more energy and amazing guy. But I want what do you? I guess other big. Well, did you say everything you wanted to say about your SafeSiders versus your new products? What are your new inventions?
SafeSiders was an extended system, but we're now cutting it back pretty much when we introduce it to new people. People who use the SafeSider, they're happy with it. They don't want to change. But if we get new people, we tell them that the creation of the glide path is a function of the SafeSiders, and then the two new instruments, the Tango Endo, again used in a reciprocating system, really for the most part shape the canals to a proper dimension. Don't forget, when you do rotary NiTi, if you put in, let's say, a 3008, you're going to produce a 3008 hole, right? Mesially, distally, you're going to superimpose that shape. When I put in a 3004 or any of my other instruments, I'm going to do something bigger, at least in the buccolingual dimension, than a 3004, because I can work it aggressively laterally. And that is a key point in my mind, to have conservative preparations mesiodistally, but remove more tissue buccolingually.
And where's that name come from, Tango? Isn't that a dance?
Well, that came from the marketing department.
Oh, the marketing.
Takes two to tango.
Okay, takes two to tango. Okay, very, very, very interesting. I also want to tell you, there's always been a, there's always been, everybody in endo says, it's what you take out of the infected tooth, not what you put in, not what you obturate. I think of you as, the post, the the file system. Talk about obturation. How significant is that? How what are the main? I mean, I imagine you've probably done 30,000 root canals. Am I about right?
I think more. More like 50,000. I once tried to figure it out because there were many years that I worked like 70 hours a week. I must have turned out. There's got to be a 20-year period where I did close to 2,000 root canals a year. I was so happy I was making a living. I thought I was going to be a bum. I turned out to be an honorable citizen.
So it's probably 80% cleaning and shaping and 20% obturation. But what are your thoughts on obturation? What?
I have definite thoughts, and you got a lot of it is my clinical experience, but I'm an avid reader of research. I
know you are.
I love reading the research, and a large bulk, nothing's consistent 100%, but a large bulk of the research says, one, rotary niti, be it continuous or interrupted, produces microcracks. There's a large body. It's from in vitro examination of teeth. It's done via micro CT scans. They're all showing that you get these microcracks. There is other research that shows now that you got these microcracks, lateral and vertical condensation exacerbates it. Okay? Which kind of makes sense. You go in with a metal spreader, and you're really going in hard to create space and, quote, to adapt cold gutta percha, you're going to use a lot of force. The problem is gutta percha is a rubber-like material. So after you adapt it and you take the pressure off this rubber-like material gutta percha, it rebounds, right? It rebounds. But it rebounds after the cement has been displaced. So when it rebounds, you tend to get a void. And the whole reason for doing all this pressure is you can put an extra point in. So that's so much for lateral condensation. I'll do some lateral condensation here and there. Generally, I do a single point, but it's based on the premise that I can flood the canal with an epoxy resin cement. It's like an AH26 type of cement that I like, okay?
What's the name of it?
We have our own. It's easy fill cement. It's essentially epoxy resin. And why I like that is because the research for years, and there's a tremendous amount of research out it, shows it's dimensionally stable, it bonds to dentin, it bonds to gutta percha, it's highly penetrable into the dental tubules, and it's also antibacterial. And it's highly resistant to hydrolytic degradation. So it's got a lot of nice properties. But the point is, I'm flooding the canal with the cement using what we call a bidirectional spiral, which is an applicator that allows us to really flood the canal with cement without driving cement, for the most part, over the apex. Then I take a pre-fitted point that I fitted it with tug back at the right length, and I coat the dickens out of that. I put that in the point. When I put that in the canal, when I put the point in, you see excess cement come out. And if there was anything close to a tight fit, I'm done. I sear that off, and I'll take an x-ray and have what appears to be a nicely well-filled canal. And obviously, having done this for years, people are not coming back with terrible failures. Okay? So that's what I would rather do. And sometimes I'll do lateral condensation, but I'll never use more force on the spreader than the weight of my hand. In other words, I'm going in passively. If I get some space, I can put another well-coated canal, fine. I sear that off, I'm done. I like the single point technique, or the way I just described the lateral condensation, over thermoplastic, which is something I never really understood, because when you do thermoplastic, you're warming it up to maybe 201 degrees C. You put the point in, and then it shrinks back. It has to cool to 37 degrees body temperature. There's certain laws of physics that you can't get away from.
And who was our common friend, the biggest fan of thermoplastic that I went to school with? Do you remember Joey D, Joe Dufkin?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's where didn't he have his spreaders? He
loved he used to call himself the endodontic squirter. And I roomed with him at Swanson Hall at Creighton University, and he passed away last year. But oh my God, he loved that. But that was so technique sensitive.
But that's my point. People fall, in a certain sense, people fall in love with complexity because if you master that complexity, you feel like you're more of an artist. And I think that's great. And man, the more talent you got, but I believe apply whatever talent you got to simpler systems that allow a higher level of predictability without having to have this super A game always available. It's just a different way. I'm not suggesting anything less than the highest quality of work. I'm saying there are far simpler ways to attain the highest quality of work. And for that, we sometimes get into prolonged discussion.
Well, let's get into prolonged discussion. Are you tight for time, or can I go into overtime with you?
You can go as long as you want. I'm going nowhere.
Okay, well, you'll never meet a dentist in your entire lifetime who's ever had a root canal fail. And I can't find the guy.
Myself in the mirror, though.
But I ask you, when you're an endodontist and you run an endodontist practice, what % of your root canals are retreats? Would you say?
Man. Oh, yeah, thank God most of them are not our retreats, but we're doing. Although we've had some of our own. Oh, I got to say, it's got to be at least maybe 50%.
Okay, so the United States has 4,000 endodontists.
Okay.
And so they're working 2,000 hours a year, and they're doing 50% retreats. And then over here you got 125,000 general dentists who all swear to God with their hand on every Bible you can think of that, well, knock on wood, I've never had one fail. And it's like, so there's something doesn't add up. If the general dentist never had a failure and 4,000 endodontists are spending half their time retreating root canals, are these all just, so is your practice limited to just immigrants from other countries who had root canals done in Zimbabwe?
One of the things I've learned, and not a little bit from your website, people are human. People are human. We all have our strengths and weaknesses, and we have a large tendency to remember things that are positive about ourselves. And you know what? I've learned to deal with that.
That's a good quality to have. Remember the good and forget about the bad. So my question is, okay, so you've probably done 40 to 50,000 implants. You graduated in 72.
No,
it's 20.
No implants.
I mean root canals. So Barry, dentists love lists. They love the top 3, the top 5, the top 10. Even the 10 commandments, are hilarious because it's not even 10 commandments. Not covet thy neighbor's wife, and thou shalt not commit adultery. That's the same thing. Shall not steal. Shall not covet the neighbor's good. Same thing. But if you could give us a list of top 3, top 5, top 10, why do root canals fail?
Well, I think one of the reasons they fail, and it's probably the most obscure, is vertical fracture. There's a fracture in there that you just maybe you didn't see it even before you did the root canal. Or maybe you induced a fracture that was a partial fracture, and then under function over years, it propagates and it becomes a full vertical fracture. So you lose a tooth there. Why else? The external restoration is failing. You're getting leakage. And once you get leakage and the bacteria are insidious, you can have had a root canal, you could add some good seals, but over 10 years they migrate from the saliva underneath the margin, work their way through maybe whatever filling you had covering the tooth, and gradually work their way down the apex. And then there's another thing. A lot of cements in previous years were what they call particulate cements. So you have things like zinc oxide eugenol, it's a particulate cement. As soon as water hits that, it starts dissolving it. See, water hits something like epoxy resin, it's much more resistant, so it can break down. So anyway, it could be 10 years after you did a root canal, all of a sudden, it's beginning to hurt me. I'm biting on it. It annoys me a little bit when I lie down. So that would be another. It's leakage, maybe frank decay, breakage, and what did I say? I said, vertical fracture. Those are the two things. What's another thing? A missed canal. You missed canal. You had some of those conservative preps, or you just can miss them. I mean, people tell me that there's 90% MB2s. Well, I'm a compulsive. I use my microscope. I take my time. I'm not in a rush to do single visit. I do many 2 visits, occasional 3 visits. And I don't always find an MB2 in a maxillary first molar, but I may have missed it. And patient comes back 10 years later, and darn if they don't have an area on that mesial root. At which point I'll look even deeper, and then on occasion, when I go back in, maybe several years later, I find the darn thing. So, you're working within very narrow parameters, and maybe you should have gone that extra little millimeter or so originally, but it didn't seem like it was something you should do at the time.
Very interesting how the first thing that came out of your mouth when we talked about endodontic failures was fractures. That was the first thing you said. And I swear on the dentists post pictures all the time. They're confused because they take out an MOD amalgam and they see a line from the mesial to the distal and it's black.
Right.
Two, and they're going to do an endo. I mean, they're always asking, should I do the endo? Or should I remove? What? Talk about what you see clinically when you see a fracture. You say, no, this is not going to work. This needs to be extracted versus this is manageable and we can have some successes.
Well, I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist. Short of seeing a fracture on the floor or creeping down, let's say, the distal canal. If I see it creeping down the distal canal, I still feel bad that it has to go because I would hope you could get some life out, but I have to tell the patient, not a very good prognosis, so that tooth could be gone. If I see a fracture that disappears before I get to the floor of the pulp, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to try and save it.
So that's the exact criteria then. If the fracture's on the roof, then you'll do the root canal. But if the fracture is all the way on the floor, that's when you say no.
Yeah, it's getting to be wishful thinking.
And I want to ask you another thing. Regarding fractures. Some people think that, that you need a CBCT of a molar before you do the root canal. Or what percent of your, talk about CBCTs, because number one, it's $100,000. Not everyone has access to it. So my question to you specifically is, to be a great endodontist like you, do I need a CBCT or access to a CBCT? And how often are you taking one?
We've got a CBCT.
What did you get?
What's the one? The one from Japan that starts with, what's it, M? I just can't think of the name, but it was the expensive one. It was the very expensive one, and it works well. And thank God I got dental assistants because they know how to use it. I know how to read the results. I don't remember all the steps to actually do it. But what it gives you, one, it gives you a very good picture, especially when you're going coronal apically, if there is an MB2, if there is a middle mesial on a lower molar. It gives you definitive information on that. The other thing it can do is it can tell you if you've got root resorptions, just where they are and what the extent of it is, because many times the periapical will give you a much more benign looking picture than what the CBC does. You'll see some things with the CBCT that really tells you that the tooth is not restorable. Then there are artifacts. I had a case just the other day where I swore I was going to do root canal on a lower molar because on the periapical x-ray, there was a little hint of something, but there were big, it was big bony trabeculations. So in other words, there was radiolucencies just tied to the large trabeculations. Anyway, make a long story short, I do the CBCT, I'm going through the slices, an area, to my mind, my interpretation, an area clearly showed on the mesial root. Go call the dentist, say, I think I found the problem. We're going to do the root canal next visit since he wasn't hurting that much. And I said, you know what? Let's really make sure you need this. If I'm right, I don't think you're going to have any pain when I drill in without anesthesia. After all, there's an area on the root. Anyway, make a long story short, as soon as I drilled in without anesthesia, he started having some pain. Took another look at the x-ray, and now I interpreted, within light of the fact that he had instantaneous pain, I interpreted that as large bony trabeculations. Told him, look, I could still be wrong, but I didn't want to do a root canal if he doesn't need a root canal. To me, that's one of the things you want to avoid. You don't want to do a root canal where it's not necessary. And he wasn't hurting worth an iota. So sometimes it gives you information that doesn't necessarily guide you to the correct diagnosis.
And the best root canal filling for a tooth is the original pulp tissue, correct?
Yeah, well, pretty good, and that's where regeneration is coming in.
What percent of the molars are you taking a CBCT on?
Honest to God, not too many. Not too many. I'd say 15%.
And what makes you?
And most of it are retreatments.
Okay, so So can I pin you down and say that you are using a CBCT for retreatments, not initial?
I use it the most for retreatments. I think that would be an accurate way of saying it.
Use it the most for retreatments.
Yeah, because I'm not doing it on the majority of the teeth.
Also, you opened up another can of worms, so I got to go into overtime, triple overtime with you. You said resorption. So explain to the viewers the difference between internal resorption, external resorption, and what your thoughts on, as an endodontist, how you approach those differently or the same.
Yeah. If I've got internal resorption and it hasn't perforated the root, I get the pulp out, the problem's done with. I'm in good shape because that thing will only progress as long as you've got vital tissue in the canal. External resorption is a whole different can of worms. It starts externally. You can try and clean it out. You hope it hasn't hit the pulp. In fact, one of the ways of differentiating is if you see an area of resorption that's over the pulp, but you can still see the original outlines of the pulp, that's external resorption. Internal resorption actually widens the entire pulpal space.
The entire from apex to...
No. It's wherever it is.
Okay.
It could be a balloon. It could be like an aneurysm.
Yeah.
That you would picture an aneurysm.
And is external resorption, they still think that's mostly trauma?
Trauma, periodontal disease can cause it. Usually it happens around the cervical level. And it's interesting that I attended this conference on pulpal regeneration, and it showed the resolution of external resorption by opening the canal and placing a triple antibiotic paste, not Dr. Grossman's old triple antibiotic, the new one. And it showed resolution of the resorption, which was amazing to me. It's only one example, so there's a lot to learn in that department.
So internal resorption, you'll do a root canal, problem solved, because if there's no pulp tissue, there's no more resorption. But what about external resorption?
Well, if the external resorption went into the nerve, I can clean it out. I can clean out all the this kind of cheesy dentin that's developed, do the root canal, fill it up with like a Geristor, and keep my fingers crossed. Also, you can use TCA, trichloroacetic acid, 90% of it. Hopefully, it kills the cells. Then put in your Geristor. But it's still a little bit of wishful thinking.
I want to ask you some more questions. I'm just going through so many questions I've seen from Dental Town. Some people, when they get done with the root canal, we're basically treating a bacterial infection, and who knows, maybe 100 years from now they'll find out it's not just bacteria. Who knows? There could be virus, fungi. Who knows what's going on? Some people will just fill the canal up with bleach and set the patient up and let it soak in there. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, Buchanan said he used to do that, let him sit there for an hour. And then other people are filling up the canal with bleach and then going in with like an ultrasonic vibrators and agitation and all that stuff. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think you have to use sodium hypochlorite because it's the only thing available that digests tissue. I think it's good if you activate it. One of the things I might add when we do our safe side is, don't forget that instrument is oscillating 3,000 to 4,000 cycles per minute in the hand. So it's a pretty good activator of the solutions that you put in. But we have to be aware whether you're using 6% sodium hypochlorite, even 3% sodium hypochlorite, 17% EDTA. These liquids have the potential to weaken the dentinal walls. That's why they say if you keep calcium hydroxide in a tooth for 5 weeks, you may have reduced the bacteria, but you've also attacked the dentin quite aggressively. So I think everything is a bit of a balance. I'm not keen on leaving the irrigants in for an hour. Not for the purpose of my time practice. I'm not worried about that. I just think it has a greater tendency to weaken the dent. Sodium hypochlorite is a rather powerful material to weaken dent, to denature it.
And another one on the some people are on using an obturation, a single carrier device like a thermofill.
Yeah.
Or I think there's another one, a soft core, where you have a carrier, you heat up the gutta percha, you single place. For an endodontist, does that make it harder for you to retreat? Do you like that obturation?
Well,
What are your thoughts on that?
The traditional carrier-based systems represent hell. They take something that could have been much simpler and made it much more difficult. But what I don't like is the fact that when you do a single point obturation on a carrier, it's again heated up. It's going to cool. So you put this in, you've got at one point a fit, it cools, it shrinks back. I don't see it. And all these systems, almost ironically, require minimal use of cement because you've occluded your coronal escape route. So if you put a lot of cement in the canal, you're going to push it over the apex. Well, nobody wants to do that, so you use very little cement. But then you say it's almost trust in God that you've got a uniform layer of cement between the gutta percha and the wall of the tooth. I don't see it. I don't see it. That plus shrinkage. Then you have the other part. Let's say you coat the point. You get denudation of the point, and the carrier is exposed as you push it. You've heard of that phenomenon.
Sure.
So it just doesn't make sense to me. There's endodontics, I believe, became one of the great commercial outlets for the major companies. And it must be so because that's why they keep innovating new products every 6 months. If it's not instrumentation, it's obturation. It's not obturation, it's access. It's constantly being innovative because there's money in it.
Big money. Big money.
So you could ask the natural question. So what makes me any different? I'm not doing it just for love. I'm doing it for money. But there's a difference between, I really believe, first of all, there's a personal difference just based on nature. But there's a difference between a small company run by dentists. I'm not a bean counter. I really want things to work. I do exactly in my office what we've developed in the products. I'm not trying to sell something that I don't want to use. I really wanted it for myself. So it's all a question of degree. We all want to make money, but do I want to be a multi-billionaire who controls elections and decides who's going to be running for the presidency? I'm not at that. I don't have those ambitions.
But you're from New York. You got to be the Donald Trump of endodontics.
No. I want to. I'm perfectly happy to be known as conjectural, but I also, more importantly, I want to be one who's really open to complete, wide open discussions.
And you are. And I love you to death.
Done politely.
I love you to death. I respect you to death. I think you're a legend in endodontics. If anybody's in Manhattan, I swear to God, I don't even have to ask Barry on this deal. If you walk in his office, it's open 7 days a week. Everybody there is, if you want to find his office, it's manhattanendodonticspecialist.com, manhattanendodonticspecialist.com. Barry's website, Essential Dental Systems, is edsdental.com or essentialdentalsystems.com. Is your email, you're giving away your age, your email's still AOL.
Yeah,
it's
I know.
MDKD, what's MDK?
That stood for the 4 original partners we had. Like Musikant, Deutsch, Case, Dukov.
Endo at AOL.com. I think there's only 3 people left on Earth that have an AOL email, Barry.
I'm probably one of them.
You got to be that young hipster guy and get Barry at gmail.com. But anyway, Barry, I took you in a triple overtime. This is the longest podcast I've ever done. It's an hour and 15 minutes. Love you to death. Thank you so much for taking an hour and 15 minutes out of your busy life.
The opportunity to express some of my opinions. I really appreciate it.
And how do you prefer, our listeners who have a question for you, how do you prefer? You prefer email, phone, your website? What do you prefer?
I've got Dave here, who's my guru. What's the best way for them to ask?
Probably email.
Yeah, do mdkdendo at AOL.com. And I'm always looking at it anyway, and I love answering questions. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. People want to ask questions there. Yeah, I mean, I would say mdkdendo is probably the most direct.
All right, love you to death, and I'll see you the next time I'm in Manhattan.
All right, I look forward to it.
Okay,
Thanks.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye then.